Good afternoon. My name is Leonardo Maltos, and today I will be detailing my research proposal on how we can increase student engagement through agency and ownership. Currently, working in the Summit Charter School system, there are a few factors that are used to guide daily instruction. The first and foremost is we do use a project-based learning environment, and so a lot of our daily lessons are rooted in constructivism and social learning theory, and a few relevant demographics to the Summit schools in Redwood City, California. The first being Everest Public School. About 95% of the students identify with a minority group, and they are majority Hispanic. And as you can see, the demographics at Summit Preparatory Charter School are very similar. Again, the majority of the students do identify as Hispanic, and that is because these schools are within walking distance of one another. And since they are both part of the same charter school system, the same project-based learning curriculum will be present in both of the schools. Currently, there are a few problems facing Summit. First and foremost is the heavy turnover, of course, with the brand new CEO that had previously been the ED or principal at Summit Prep is now in the CEO role. And so that means there is a new principal at Summit Prep, and the entire admin team has actually been refreshed. And in filling some of those roles, a lot of the teachers went with them. So over a third of the teachers at Summit are either new or they are long-term substitutes and will not be there for the entirety of the year. Another issue is the widespread disengagement within the school itself. One of the main problems I'm seeing is just students wandering the hallway during instruction or class, and the rampant cell phone use that was used last year, both during instruction, in free periods, and really whenever students would appreciate the ability to access their cell phones. They were able to opt out of class at any time and use their phones, which created more and more disengagement as the year went on. And with a new CEO, there are also a lot of top-down rules being enforced that the students are really not used to and do need to adjust to. The biggest one, of course, being the cell phone crackdown, which has been a shock to many of our students in the first week back to school. The aims of this research project will be first and foremost to increase student engagement in the classroom, supporting new teachers as they transition into the Summit model and better familiarize themselves with the curriculum. And finally, we are hoping to encourage adherence to these new rules by allowing students the opportunity to integrate them into classroom instruction themselves. And so in order to accomplish this, we have a few guiding research questions. The first being, how can educators create a more engaging environment? The next regards is in reference to students and is asking, how do students respond to increased agency over their learning environment? And what is the academic impact of allowing students to define their own classroom expectations? There will be a more in-depth literature review coming up. However, the main guiding question that came out of the literature review is, how do students respond to increased agency over their learning environments? And my hypotheses in order of most likely to least likely are that students' perceptions of the classroom experience will be more positive, obviously, since they are having input on the type of environment they will be engaging in every day. They are less likely to create an environment they don't want to be a part of. I also expect stronger adherence to the norms that are set within the class. We will go over a few examples of why I think that is. And finally, we expect increased engagement across the board. Again, these are in order from most to least likely. Ideally, we would like to see all three of these outcomes. And so in reviewing the literature, a few authors or a few researchers stood out. The first one being Chip Chase, who outlined different forms of motivation, both intrinsic and extrinsic. And so these could include something like intrinsic motivation would be if a student is feeling that they are not able to pass or that they're not able to reach their goals, they might become discouraged. And extrinsic motivation would be external factors such as teaching quality or the overall learning environments. And Chip Chase concluded that both intrinsic and extrinsic motivators do have a positive correlation with academic outcomes. And so most of the early research in the literature review was focused on this question of motivation. Code was incredibly useful in consolidating much of the previous research and defining many key terms used throughout the study, including words like agency and motivation. And in addition to all that, she also modeled instruments that could be used to gather qualitative data in this study, namely the student surveys and the sorts of questions that could be asked. Stanky and Blomek outline the significance of educator experience in the classroom, and they highlighted the differences between reactive behavior correction, which is typically a practice used by new teachers who are seeing the symptoms of a disengaged classroom and are attempting to fix the behavior, and the improvement of the actual educational environment itself, which is a strategy used mostly by experienced teachers. And building on that, Toth, who did look into the motivational impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, also found that one way to mitigate the gap between novice and experienced teachers was to use student-driven classroom management strategies, which leads us to Toe, who detailed one potential innovation, which is the co-creation of norms as a student-driven classroom management strategy. And this works to address student engagement in a manner that is consistent with Summit's project-based model. And so as we move forward, I will detail more on the educator's role in integrating that project-based intervention into allowing students to create their own classroom expectations. And as we had detailed earlier, participant selection would ideally include seniors from both the Redwood City Summit schools, that would be Summit Everest and Summit Preparatory Charter School. And the reason I would like to invite both groups of students is that every senior within the Summit Public School system must take AP Government. And so there is a similarity in the curriculum within the classroom. The demographics are similar. It would allow for a larger sample size, and really based on proximity, it would seem to be a fairly simple joint research in study. And by balancing the extremely experienced AP Government teacher at the Everest School with myself, who is a new teacher at Summit Preparatory Charter School, this allows for evaluation of other potential extrinsic motivators, such as teaching quality and overall learning environment. Of course, Toth would say that since we are using a student-led classroom management strategy, that the gap should be mitigated. And so this would also provide a way to verify Toth's work. And so the role of the researcher within this study will be, again, ideally, we would have participation from my colleague over at Summit Everest, who is also teaching AP Government to the seniors. And as an action researcher, we would be both educator and researcher in this case, and providing engaging instruction is just part of Summit's project-based model. And so what we would do is create a control group that would go through the normal AP government curriculum without any modifications. And then an experimental group would have one additional project at the start of the year that would guide them through developing class norms. For those of you unfamiliar with Summit's model, how it works is each unit is described as a project, and all of the lessons within the unit are checkpoints. And so these mini checkpoints within the project, the first project, would promote students to reflect on their expectations and goals for the year, and then guide them in developing norms that would allow them to achieve that. And so we would have students work on those checkpoints before coming together for a final project where they would create their own classroom expectations and ultimately participate in the creation of classroom expectations as a whole. The project has been detailed more thoroughly. However, one key aspect to creating these norms will be that every student has to sign the final document, therefore signaling their intention to adhere to the norms throughout the year. Researchers will also be responsible for collecting response data. However, this process can be made much more simply using the Summit Learning Platform so that student surveys can be delivered directly via student Chromebook, and we can receive that data automatically without having to transcribe any sort of handwritten response. Qualitative data used for this study would largely be those studies that I had described that would reflect on student attitudes towards the learning environment that they created. Now, we are not expecting a too large of a sample size, probably at most 100 students in both the experimental and the control group. And so using a word cloud could be a rather effective way, since all of the data will come in digitized. We can go ahead and start looking for themes in that way. As far as the quantitative data, there are two main sources. The first will be the level of participation, and that will be including both written and oral responses to prompts and classroom activities, as well as overall academic performance, which will be measured by the Summit Cognitive Skill rubrics. Attaching levels of participation and overall academics to performance in the specific classrooms will be important when controlling for potential inequities such as teacher experience, right? So if the work of TOEFL is correct and these student-driven classroom management strategies are effective, then we should see a mitigation of these inequities. However, the work of Stanke and Blumek does show that there will be a gap in achievement between novice teachers and those who are more experienced. Attaching these data sets to individual students could also be interesting in that it would allow for us to measure cognitive skill development across different subjects. Again, for those of you who are not familiar with the Summit model, it is a mastery-based grading system that tracks cognitive skills such as the ability to make an argumentative claim or select relevant sources, things of this nature on a scale of 1 through 8, which is clearly defined in those rubrics. And so regardless of whether it is an English class or honestly, even in some STEM classrooms, there is an overlap in cognitive skills. Some limitations and ethical considerations would be that the students are attending the same charter school system. And so one of the unique aspects of the Summit model is they do highlight specific habits, one of which is agency. And so the students do already have a culture of being able to shape their learning environment. And so that may make defining their own classroom expectations more familiar than it could be with a more traditional educational environment. And the schools are also within walking distance of each other and serve very similar populations. And so what works here at Summit may not work at other public schools or even some of the Summit schools up in Washington because they serve different populations. Some ethical considerations could be that the control groups would face a larger degree of inequity if they are in a school with a less experienced teacher. If the work of Toth is to be believed, then the student-led classroom management strategies may mitigate some of the inequity. However, the control group will not have access to those student-driven classroom management strategies and therefore will be more impacted by the quality of teaching they are exposed to. Additionally, action research does not allow for anonymity, and so it will be very important to highlight that when sending out informed consent to the parents. Here are some of the references used throughout the research proposal. If there are any questions, now would be the time.